Hello and welcome to today's webinar, sponsored by GoToWebinar and brought to you by the Content Marketing Institute. My name is Joe Polizzi, the founder of the Content Marketing Institute, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar entitled Supercharging Your Webinar Demand Generation Outcomes, Part 1. Remember, this is Part 1 in a Part 2 series. We're going to go behind the scenes on how to host a successful webinar, and really happy that you're able to join us today. So before I introduce Mike, I just want to kind of set the stage for when we're talking about content marketing. And obviously we're talking about owning your own media channels versus renting. We're talking about attracting and retaining customers through valuable, relevant, and compelling content. And we're talking about information versus a sales pitch, right? We know that for the most part, the sales content that we create is only good at about 1% of the buying cycle. Most of the time when people want to look at our sales content, they're ready to buy. They're good. So you're fine there. You have enough of that information. But really what we want to look at is how we can be the leading informational expert in our industry through case studies, through best practices, through showing real business value. So that's why Mike and I talked about putting this series together today and how critical it is to talk about how you can get the most value out of your webinars when you really talk about educational information. This is from the Content Marketing Institute Marketingprofs 2013 Benchmarking and Budgets Research Report. And we found there's a couple things. First of all, what's really good about this whole thing, if you look at effectiveness ratings, we call it the confidence gap between those people that feel content marketing is working for them versus those that feel that it's not working so well. Webinars and webcasts rank right at the top there. 61% say it's working for them. But unfortunately, it's sort of a little virtual tear in Mike and my own eye. And how can we get the 40% of you that aren't seeing the results through your webinars? How can we get that and move you to the other side? So the rest of this webinar is really going to be about the how-to and how you can make webinars work for yourself. And right now what I'm going to do is bring in Mike Agron. Now, Mike, just a real quick thing about Mike. If I have a question about webinars, Mike's the go-to person for me. He's the co-founder of WebAttract. And really out there, he's probably, a lot of people call me the godfather of content marketing. This is the godfather of webinars and webcasts. So I'm really excited that we were able to get this. I want you to take it away and really lead this thing forward.
Thank you so much, Joe, and welcome to the audience. And calling me the godfather and you the godfather, here I am in Manhattan. Pretty appropriate place. Folks, we've got a lot of information we're going to cover. And as Joe said, webinars, the good news is they rank pretty close to the top of a lot of the tactics that folks like you are using. What we want to be able to do is give you some tips and tricks and insights to really make your confidence in them even more. Now, part of this series, everybody who registers has either received or can get a free copy of our book called Webinar Ready. This was co-sponsored with Citrix, and it was written to talk about how to host a webinar based on methodologies, best practices, and metrics that we've used using the Citrix platform. It's perfectly appropriate for other platforms too. So if you haven't already downloaded your copy, we'll give you some information at the end, but I ask you to do that. And a lot of what we're going to go through that I don't need to spend time on is already in here full of checklists, but I'm going to go through some things that may not be in here that we want you to know. So let's get started with today. And today we're going to go behind the scenes, and we're going to talk about three things on how to host successful webinars. The first is, how do you set the stage? What do you need to do to plan? How do you get the right audience and more of them? And then how do you begin to breathe life into your production? Next month we're going to go into the other subjects, and we're going to talk about, once you've created your content strategy, how do you make sure that it resonates and connects, and you do the appropriate sound checks and the dry runs or dress rehearsals. And then we'll talk about your final checklist and going live. And then how do you, after the webinar, follow up on all that great information and work with people who may not be ready to buy but want to learn more from you. So those are the things that we're going to cover. And we really want you to challenge us. I want to challenge you, and part of that will come in the Q&A. But what we want you to walk away with is that effectiveness and confidence in any event, particularly webinars, is based on having a proven, repeatable methodology. Along with that, you need to have best practices so you optimize your results. And then you have to have key metrics that ensure your success and give you predictability. If you do that, you delight your audience and you're able to deliver predictable outcomes. And at the end of the day, as a demand gen expert, you're able to convert more prospects into customers, which is why you're doing the webinar to begin with. So if we look at that and we try to take what are the challenges, what we have found is there's 3 challenges. There's attracting the audience, then there's engaging them when they attend, and then inspiring them to want to have a conversation with you after the webinar and begin to convert them from prospects to customers. By being able to predict and exceed your commercial outcomes, you can also add value and delight your audience. And that's really what we're trying to do here too. We want to make sure that your audience is delighted. So to do that, I'd like to hear from you now. I'm going to launch a quick poll, and Joe and I are going to be very interested in your results. The poll is open. If you would go ahead and just vote for one, what would you say are your biggest webinar challenges? Folks, thank you so much for voting. I'm going to close the poll. Let's now share the results. And as you can see on your screen, number 1 at 44% is attracting the right audience, getting more people. 19% is engaging. 31% is converting them. 6% say other. So I'd love to learn what that other is, but that's a great place to start. We're now going to start with the first act. And you will see that we use a lot of theatrical metaphors in what we do, and that's because webinars are a mini event, and they are theatrical in nature. And so we break up the various parts of the production into various acts. So the first thing is setting the stage. And what we always do is we think of a webinar as a radio show, but with pictures. Within an hour time frame, we're going to use our voice and tell stories, use pictures to get our points across. But as I said, it is a mini theatrical event. We find that from the time someone says, let's go, to go live, you need a budget 6 to 8 weeks. And the first thing you want to do is understand how to set the stage, how to recruit the audience, how to develop your content, how to go live, and what you do afterwards. And these are the things that we're going to talk about. But in this webinar life cycle, the reason we say it's 6 to 8 weeks, it takes time in the beginning to really be clear on what your objectives are and to work through your campaigns for doing your audience recruitment. Can you do it in faster time? Yeah. Can you do it in a longer time? A little bit. 6 to 8 weeks just seems to be the right time to be able to put a webinar together. But the other thing to remember is it's an ongoing balancing act. It's not just the technology, which we love, but it's also the business drivers. It's also the logistics and scheduling, the human factors. It's balancing all of these across the life cycle and making sure that you're able to manage all of these moving parts. And in doing that, we want to look at each of these acts as having a methodology and certain best practices and certain metrics. And I'm going to get into these as we go through this. But let's start with Act 1. This is the scheduling and project kickoff. First things you want to do is define your objectives, your target audience, what are your outcomes and success factors. Then you want to set up a webinar project line, and you want to gather the ensemble, and that's your team, which is usually virtual. You want to hold a kickoff meeting, and the kickoff meeting helps everybody get on the same page and understand what the goals are, and then schedule your webinar. And you do this because there's an enormous opportunity to gather what we call life cycle intelligence, and you can do this before the webinar, during, and after. And we'll talk a little bit about what you do before today, but mostly is to gather profile data, understand their interest, and use social media. Ensuring predictable outcomes only happens when you're clear on what your objectives are. Is it lead gen? Is it thought leadership? Is it brand awareness? What are you going to give your value, or what value are you going to give your audience that they otherwise wouldn't get if they didn't attend your webinar? And what are your success factors? How do you know if the webinar will be successful? What's your call to action? Not only your call to action to your audience, but what are you going to do to follow up? And you want to make sure that you've captured the life cycle intelligence to analyze it. And you'll see how that comes in just a moment. So if I were to summarize the setting the stage, which is probably one of the most important parts of the webinar, always manage with a written work plan and a list. And there's a lot of lists and examples in the book. You want to schedule and book key meetings way in advance. You've got to remember that people, as much as they want the webinar to be a success, have a day job. And in having a day job, you need to get this on their calendar way in advance. I can tell you from experience, we spend a lot of time with logistics, arranging meetings so people can attend. And then prepare to invest 1 hour of pre-production time for each live minute. That may sound like a lot, but when you see the steps that you have to go through to get it all right, that's about what you need to do. All right, now let's talk about the biggest challenge, which is recruiting the audience. This is where you want to get the right audience and more of them to register. But in order to do that, there's 5 things that have to be done. You need to be able to source the right audience that's going to match your value proposition. You need to put a compelling invitation together that attracts. You need to create a registration landing page that's clear, that gets people on and off. You need to execute your audience recruitment plan with precision. And you need to track your registration metrics. So we're going to spend time on each of these. So the most important metric that we have learned to depend on is what we call the click-through ratio. And this is something that we use before the webinar. And let me explain it to you. What it measures is the percent of people who register that came to your registration page. So if 100 people came to your registration page and 30 people registered, you'd have a click-through ratio of 30%. But it's more than that, because it predicts what kind of registration you're going to have, what kind of attendance you're going to have. It's also going to allow you to know whether or not your value proposition is connecting with the audience. The information that you get from this is phenomenally helpful and strategic. Now, let's also talk about what type of expectations you should have. Usually, we like to look at a targeted demographic of about 50,000 people, and we're going to talk about where you can find them. And if you use a targeted demographic of 50,000 people, conservatively, you should be able to have people register between 1/4 to 1/2 of 1%. And how that breaks down is this. Let's say from that 50,000, 750 reach your landing page, which means 49,250 never get to your landing page. So we're talking about a numbers game here. If we're looking at the low at 1/4 of 1%, and we have a click-through ratio of 16%, 16.6%, we'll get 125 people to register. And the attendance ratio that we usually experience is 40%. You'll get 50 plus or minus. If you're up at the higher end at 1/2 of 1%, you'll have a click-through ratio of 33%. 250 people will register, and about 100 people will attend. Joe, I'm wondering if that comports with some of the things you've been seeing.
You know, a lot of it has to do, I know you're going to talk about this, but a lot of it has to do with the content as well. I think that for a lot of the brands we work with, that's in general what we've seen. We see a little bit higher at Content Marketing Institute. We go out to a list of about 30,000, and we tend to get between 500 and 1,000 registered for that. So it's a little bit higher, but I think it's also we just have an engaging audience. So I guess the only thing that I would add to it is some audiences are more engaging than others, but I like your numbers. I think it's right in the ballpark.
And I like the fact that you brought up content, because that's exactly the next topic on, what really drives registration. I'll tell you what we have found. A lot of people will say, oh, it's how elegant the invitation is. It's got a pop. It's this and that. Yeah, that's all important. But you know what? If your topic is not a must-have and it's a nice-to-have, forget it. Joe, how many webinar invitations do you think you get a day in your inbox, or a week?
Okay. A day, probably between 7 to 10.
Okay. And I think that's reasonable, and I think if I could see everybody in the audience, they'd have the same experience. If it's not something that's absolutely a must-have, and I'm going to tell you how to make it a must-have, people will ignore it. And again, as you said, this is why I think that webinars are a high form of content marketing. It's not about selling. It's about information. People are always listening to radio station WIFM. What's in it for me? There's got to be something compelling. What also drives registration is making sure that the value proposition aligns with the audience. That's absolutely a given. And the credibility of the panelists. You want to make sure you've got panelists that are recognizable, that attract people. Certainly part of the success of content marketing world are the panelists that you have. You get the greatest and smartest people in content marketing, that draws people. Another area that drives registration is the recognition of the brand sponsor. But I'm going to show you a couple examples that might surprise you, where the sponsor for one of the webinars is local but had phenomenal results. But having a brand that's recognizable also helps in attracting people, and having a solid execution plan, which we're going to go into. Now, webinars are very ripe as magnets for attracting prospects to become your customers. But here's where you split them into must-have versus nice-to-have. They're either like the fellow on the left who knows there's some disruption going on in his business, in his industry. There's pain points associated with it, or he or she knows they should have better outcomes, but they're not really sure what they are, but they're aware of it. Or, like the lady on the right, she's actively looking for a solution. The most important part of this slide is that people who are either experiencing disruption, pain, or looking for better outcomes, or looking for a better solution are the ones that are going to want to register for your webinar. And in doing an audience recruitment plan, it's always important to segment the target audience. And Joe, I think we could spend a webinar on each one of these slides, so bear with me as I go through them. And a lot of this is covered in the book, but these things are very important. Segment the audience into the industries you want. Look at their job functions, their titles. Use other filters such as revenue or number of employees, and what geographies do you want. That'll help you build up to your 50,000. And then you need to source your list. And this is another area where there's so many options out there, but the most important thing is only use sources that you can trust for deliverability, quality, and reliability. And some of those sources could be in-house, could be a rental. There's also people out there that offer guaranteed lead programs or a cost per lead. You only pay for what they deliver. I think a great source are media partners, such as the print or online publisher. We've seen phenomenal results with them. Or you can outsource it to organizations such as us who are able to work this. But these are the various list sourcing strategies that you want to be aware of. Now, we've identified where we're going to get our list from, but now we want to come and put together an invitation that's compelling, that attracts the right audience. I'm going to go through this here, and I'm also going to give you some examples. The first attribute of the invitation is the webinar title. You want something to grab attention. I gave an example of a webinar we did. We worked with a thought leader. His name is Craig Elias, and he talks about shift marketing. And what he talks about in shift marketing is how there are trigger events that create buying opportunities. So we were going to a marketing audience, and we knew marketers have a sense of humor. So we came up with the title, Give a Shift, Harnessing Webinars to Convert More Prospects into Customers. It worked. People liked it. Then you want to give a brief description. What is this going to be as a must-have topic? And you want to write it in the audience's jargon. Then you want 3 or 4 bullets. You want to summarize the phrases of what your audience will learn. The call to action is register now. Now, what's important here is make the singular call to action to easily register, get to your landing page, get off. Personally, we never give away free Starbucks cards or any offers until they register. I'd rather them register because they want to be there. And then, if you have a speaker or a brand, you want to leverage their credentials. You want to use headshots to humanize and always identify who should attend. It ensures people that will see this will self-identify. Joe, I'm going to go to the next slide to show a couple examples. Did you want to add anything to this?
No, I think you're absolutely dead on, and I don't think in our experience enough people really are thoughtful enough about the webinar title. I mean, we've had a lot of experience even in blog titles or white paper. Everything is so important in the title. If you don't have something that's compelling from a title standpoint, and I would work on various versions of it, test it out internally and externally to see what's going to work. And you can even obviously do A/B tests with your email deployment if that makes sense, and test the ones that work better.
Absolutely. I'm going to talk about that. Thank you. So let's take a look at this for just a second. And it's for a global or a national brand, Bosch Healthcare, but it's a new division. And they've got something to talk about using advanced remote patient monitoring through new coding options. So if you look at the title, it says Advanced Remote Patient Monitoring through New Coding Options. Subtitle, learn how a new unique S code and existing T codes can be used to bill for telehealth services. Tells you right away what it's for. If you look on the left where my mouse is, here's a brief description of what you're going to learn. Here's the 3 to 4 bullets of what you'll get. Here's who should attend. Register now. Leverage the speaker's credentials. We put headshots to humanize them. Highlight the sponsorship. The length of the email is inconsequential to the value and the clarity of what it's offering. And so this is something that I'll show you in just a moment that is just blowing the numbers off the charts as far as acceptance, because it's timely. People are looking for better outcomes. This is exactly what resonates. So let me move this on. Here's another one, and this is not a global brand. This is a local brand. And this was someone who wanted to reach marketing professionals and talk about direct mail programs. And so this was how the most successful direct mail programs do more with less. Best practices that drive profitable growth in the digital age. Now, we only had the proprietor and the founder of the company, Rick Rapay, who's great. And we said, Rick, you need to have a third-party subject matter expert give credibility to this, because without it, it's just going to sound like a sales pitch. So we recruited Linda Pofall, who is an author and an expert, and she wrote a book that's called Direct Mail Marketing in the Digital Age. And so she was on to set the stage. Where's the industry going? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? It allowed Rick to come in and give some finer points. But again, very much the same format as the other one. And at the bottom here, it says social media. We use a social media badge on our marketing automation platform. I think it's probably available on most. We use a platform called Sales Fusion. And what it does is it allows you as the recipient to promote this, to forward it to a friend. So these are two different examples, but both follow the same guidelines that we have. After you've developed that, you want to be able to have a place for the people to go to register. And in this case here, this is the registration landing page. It should be a summary of your invitation, concise. You don't want to regurgitate the whole summary. Nobody wants to read it. They just want to know, oh, this is why I'm registering. And you want to use this to ask relevant but non-invasive questions. I would highly recommend not to ask, are you the decision maker, the influencer, how much money do you have, when are you going to buy? Someone's going to read that and say, sales pitch, I'm not interested. But obtain intelligence. What is their industry? What is their name and title? What geography are they in? But probably the most important thing you can ask at this point, and we do this for every webinar, is what would you like to learn? Ask them and make it mandatory. And here's why. If all they want is a Starbucks card, let them go someplace else. You want people on your webinar that care, that want to learn, and they will tell you what's important. And you'll see in the next section on how we use this information. Joe, I cannot tell you how much we learn from our audience before we meet them on what they want to learn. It tells us if we're on the money or not.
Boy, the more of that information you can get up front, the better it's going to be.
You bet. Now, let's look at how we're going to execute for our audience recruitment. Start 3 weeks before you go live. Now, maybe some of you who are wondering why I say it takes 6 to 8 weeks can understand that it took us a couple of weeks to get to this point, and we've got at least 3 weeks left to promote. But the most important item in getting your invitation opened and read is the subject line. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. If your subject line doesn't grab them, forget it. I don't care how great it is inside. They're not going to open it. And I think, Joe, you were mentioning the importance of subject lines. Use daily tracking metrics to adjust your strategy. I will show you how you do that. Absolutely will tell you if you're connecting or not. And then for each blast, drip, or touch point, do a subject swap. Change the title on what the recipient is going to get. And I'll show you how that works. And do A/B testing. Always make it easy for people to unsubscribe. If people want to unsubscribe, Make it easy so they unsubscribe, and always be CAN spam compliant. Don't harvest leads, only send it to people that are looking for information that would be of value or know you. And we recommend that you optimize your results with 4 or more timed e-broadcast, and I'll show you the results of that too. So let's talk about daily registration tracking. So what just popped up on the screen are 2 graphs. The upper graph is actually of the campaign we have now on advanced remote patient monitoring. We launched this on May 9th. We were looking for 1/4 to 1/2 of 1%, and we had about a 50,000 targeted demographic. So 250, had we delivered 250 registrants, we would have been very happy. So far, we're at 439. What is it telling us? If you look here at that click-through ratio, 43%, 52%, 64%. The market and the audience sees tremendous value in this. They vote by clicking to join the webinar. So all of this here is information that's also in the book that we use, that we measure every day how many registrations are coming in, and then we measure against that for each touch point with the period. First one was 5 days. How many people clicked on the registration link? How many registered? What was the ratio? That goes back to what I said earlier. What's really cool about GoToWebinar is all of this information can be easily extracted on their registration reports. It tells you every time you run one how many people clicked on the link, how many people registered. Now let's take a look and go back to our friend on direct mail marketing. We had, again, a match demographic of 50,000. We had 275 people register. What's most amazing about this was the conversion rate was the highest I've ever seen, 63%. So for every 100 people that came, 63 registered. The attendance also was over 50%. So that predictor of attendance was also from the registration. Joe, I bet you're probably wondering or curious, was there really that much interest in direct mail marketing? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess for people that are interested in direct mail, absolutely. I guess what I'm wondering, and maybe a lot of the other people are wondering as well, is you showed those averages before, and obviously those case studies that you're showing are doing much better. I guess that's because you're following the execution plan, but is it really that most people aren't executing very well with their webinars, and that's why the average is so low?
Yes, absolutely. Look, when we do a kickoff meeting, we get the clients to get to know one another, and sometimes there's some groans and moans, or why are we doing all this? Well, you know what, folks? It's your brand on the line. You've only got one shot at this thing. You need to plan and you need to work it. They get religion and they see the results of there, but absolutely. And the problem is if people try to compress this, Joe, and do it too fast, they make mistakes. They don't get to iterate and collaborate. So this is all part of why it works. And I will tell you, too, there have been some campaigns that haven't been as stellar, okay? I tend to underpromise and overdeliver. That's why I go 1/4 of 1%. Sometimes we'll get a little bit more than that. A few times we've been under it. And a lot of the reasons are some of the things I covered. It wasn't a real must-have. It was seen more as a product pitch, even as much as we try to disguise it or make it not that way. That's how it was perceived. But all of these here have been successful because they follow all the guidelines that I've been talking about.
Well, the one more thing on that, Mike, that I think is critical and everybody needs to be aware of is if you are doing a webinar that has a salesy topic to it, or it's clearly shown that it's not just informational and helpful, your opt-out rate will go up much, much higher. And that's my concern, and when we do webinars is we want to make sure that it's really, really relevant, because if they opt out, I can't get back in touch with them.
Yep.
They've opted out of those emails for them, and I've lost them.
You're absolutely right, and that's a great point, and I'm going to show the unsubscribe rate and why that's important. But to what you said, we did something not too long ago for a client. It looked fantastic. It was about how to use composites beyond aerospace. And the reason that's interesting is aerospace manufacturers and engineers understand composites, but in a lot of legacy industries, they don't know that it can get to market. They can get to market quicker, can reduce their cost. But the people that we had, and they were fabulous, they were both selling a software product. We bombed. We had a 2% click-through ratio. It was do not resuscitate. It flatlined. It was, hello, Houston, we have a problem. What we did was we looked at it, we assessed it, and we said we need a third-party expert. And so we got the editor from Composites world to come on and immediately transform the experience of people receiving this to say, okay, I'm going to learn something. And we went from having maybe 30 people register in 10 days to I think we had 400 people by the time we went live. So these things do work, but you're absolutely right. If you make it salesy, people are smart enough and they're not going to be there. Now, A/B testing. All right. This is, again, Joe mentioned this earlier. This is very, very important. Again, marketing automation allows you to do this. So here's what we did, and I'm going to show you the results. For the first touch point, we went out, and this was a webinar on assisted living. And so what it said in the subject line was assisted living webinar, boost service levels and occupancy rates. Okay, interesting. Then we looked at the results and we said, we need to leverage the credibility of the people on this webinar. Well, we were fortunate to have a very well-known senior editor from a publication called McKnight's Long-Term News. And we put in the subject line, McKnight's senior editor discusses occupancy challenges. Now look what happened. If you take a look here, if you go and you see I have a red bounding box where it says status on the right, that's where we added that. We increased our click-through ratio from the first touch point by 50%. Also, we had only a match demographic of 19,000 people. So 1/2 of 1% would have been, I think, let's see, 1/2 of 1% would have been a lot less than we came up with. And we actually came up with 151 people, 151 people to register and 79 to attend. But putting that credibility in there helped. And that's the point here. You've got to be thinking about, here is probably one of my most favorite counterintuitive examples of a question I often get asked. And people say, Mike, aren't you concerned that if you have so many touch points or drips, you're going to get people to unsubscribe? And the answer is no. And in fact, what the proof points show is that if you have a demographic that is receptive to your message and you're not spamming them, you're giving them something of interest, your unsubscribes will actually go down with each touch point. And here's how it happens. An unsubscribe rate is someone who receives the invitation and decides, not for me, I'm not interested, and they click on unsubscribe. And Joe, as you said, they opted out. We like to see the red line for unsubscribes is 2%. To us, it's 1%. So that means if you get 1% of the people you've mailed to unsubscribing, you probably want to look at it. But in this case here, we had, for the first blast, 107 people unsubscribe, or 0.56%. For each blast, and what we do is we suppress each blast with all the people that registered. If somebody's registered, they don't need to get an invitation to register again. We suppress that. But if you look at it, we ended up sending 94,000 emails, and our total unsubscribe was 0.32%. Isn't that interesting, Joe?
It is interesting, and you feel, I guess, just still concerned about the rate of unsubscribes, but it sounds like as long as this is an acceptable range of unsubscribes that you're going to get regardless. Is that pretty much what you're saying?
Absolutely. And again, yeah, because we're sending people information that is relevant, that's timely. They just may not be interested for whatever reason, but these are very, very low numbers. So out of 94,000, 303 said unsubscribe me. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that to me, this is one of the most counterintuitive things. You would think the opposite would happen. Anyway, think about that. Without a doubt, the audience is always your top priority. Your audience is gracious enough to give up their time. They vote to attend your webinar. Make sure what you are asking them to give up an hour for, they're going to get something in return. The relevancy aligns with a must-have topic. If it's really relevant to them, it's a must-have. Again, collaborate and iterate. You cannot You cannot do this too much. There are so many things that need to be managed here. And what we find is we go back and forth with clients. Well, what about this? What about that? Well, let's change this, let's change that, and we always come out with a better product. 4 eyes are better than 2, 6 eyes are better than 4. Start this campaign 3 weeks before you go live. That gives you a time to do your A/B testing and swap your subject lines. You may have to make some corrections, but if you have 3 weeks before they go live, you're able to do it. And again, test, and measure your daily outcomes. Cannot underestimate how important that is or overestimate that. Is one of the most important things you can do is to track it. Joe, I'm going to move into the last section, but before I do, any comments you want to lay on the audience recruitment?
No, we got a couple questions, and I'm going to, because I should have asked it in behind, but I wanted to talk really quickly about the preparation time. And there were a couple people that, right as you said, I think you said 1 hour per produced time, that you're saying production time, and so people were saying, are you kidding me? Can you just clarify that, and what's an acceptable range? Because it does, well, that's, if you're doing a 30-minute webinar, then you're basically saying you need 30 hours of time to produce that. I mean, go through that a little bit and make us feel a little bit better about the time we're investing.
Sure. If you're going to subscribe to this methodology that we have, where you recognize that this is your brand, you want to maximize the outcomes, you want to delight your audience, you know that, and we're looking for a demand, this is a demand generation webinar. This isn't a training webinar or a product demo, but you want to attract the right audience. It takes time to understand what their needs are, what your objectives are. It takes time to understand who the speakers are going to be. There's time to source the list. There's time to draft the invitation, to go back and forth, to pour it into an HTML mold, to test it. There's a lot of time that's involved here, and absolutely we'll stand behind that number. To do it right and to get the kind of results, that's what it takes. And you had asked me earlier, why do you think some people may not get those kind of results? I would have to say it's in the planning. It just takes a lot of time. There's just a lot of moving parts here. And in the book, it explains a lot of it, and I'm going through a lot of it. I mean, everything I'm going through here takes hours for us to accomplish. Does that kind of give you an idea?
It absolutely does, and I would say where most brands don't spend enough time is actually on the content of the presentation itself. I see a lot that are just kind of whipped together, or if they bring on an expert, they don't take the time to actually review that and make sure it's hitting the brand's or the sponsor's objectives, because a lot of times it's not, and you got to take that prep time and that training time ahead to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, and I mean, look, this is an acquired or embraced strategy and philosophy and methodology. It's not for everybody. Okay, I'm not going to say that it is, but if you want to have results that meet or exceed your commercial outcomes and delight your audiences, this is what you have to do. Now, we've got the invitation, we've executed the campaign, now we're going to go into the first part of content creation. And I said now we're going to go into it. A lot of times clients want to come to the kickoff meeting with their slides, and it's like, well, we haven't even identified who the audience is or what the deliverables are. Let's take a look at it, but let's kind of wait and see what we promised we were going to deliver. And they go, oh, okay, that makes sense. We want to bring the team or the ensemble together for what we call a table read. That's where we're going to do some brainstorming, and we're going to architect our flow by using the invite to see what are the key messages and bullets. We're going to use all the intelligence gathered before the webinar. What do you want to learn? Who's signing up? All of this stuff, Joe, is stuff that we use to help shape the webinar. And we want to determine who's going to say what and when. This bullet sounds like you, Joe. This bullet sounds like you, Mike. You'll take that? Okay. And then once we get through that, we want to get ready to start dress rehearsals. Hopefully some of you can see where some of the time comes in. But the thing that I love most about webinars, it's that it's a time for storytelling. What we want to be able to do is tell a story. We don't want to have a death by PowerPoint. We want to find the passion in our speakers, to have them come from their own experience and tell the audience something on how they learned something or how they did it. And that takes time. To give them some information on message shaping ideas, this goes back to what I said during registration when you asked what would you like to learn. This is actually from that webinar we did on assisted living. This is just a snapshot. So the executive director, we said, what would you like to learn? And one of the executive directors says, how do you boost occupancy and quality and care? New ideas, appropriate levels of care for each resident, how to increase occupancy. Kind of told us that there's an interest in occupancy. Administrator, how do you improve care through this system? Sales and occupancy strategies. The point is, we go through all of these in all 151, and we look at them and see what are the trends, and we suggest to some of the panelists, you know, you may want to focus on this. Like we said to Elizabeth from McKnight's, there's a lot of interest in where the industry's going on technology. Could you talk about that? She said, sure. So we fine-tuned it and made it more relevant. And then we want to sit down and start to take the hour and break it into bite-sized segments. Who's going to do the welcome? That was you, Joe. You told who was in the audience, housekeeping tips. And then we want to do a poll as an icebreaker. We want to learn about the audience. Then we want to introduce the speakers. And then we want to have the speakers on and know what they're going to talk about and have a call to action, have a second poll, and then we want to leave time for Ask the Experts. All of this is iterative. It takes time to go back and forth. This is where the time starts to add up and making all of this work. People are busy, they have a day job, but we want them to understand where they fit in here so they don't sound like they showed up for the webinar and sound surprised. Joe, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm sure you've been on those kind of webinars where the speakers, you know, do these guys even have a clue?
Well, the other thing is, I love the way you have this broken out. Everybody needs to know that every 10 to 15 minutes you need something to reset the audience. Like purposefully, you and I talked about this one, and you kind of throw it back to me, and we have a little conversation about something. That's purposeful to make sure we're resetting the audience, and some people that maybe we're dragging a little bit, we bring them back to life.
Exactly, exactly. It's people want, and we'll talk about this next month. People want a dialogue, not a monologue. They don't want you. They don't want to be read slides. They want to hear people converse. But what's important when you go into your content creation, use the invite to architect the flow. Resist people coming to your webinar practice sessions with their slides that don't align to the invite. Number one, it's not going to give the audience what they wanted. Number two, you're going to eat up valuable time. Deliver on what you promised. If you said we were going to cover these three things, cover them. Create the flow to align with your key bullets. Budget the time for the welcome, the polls, and the Q&A. And actually, there's probably 35 minutes of actual on-air time, and you need to use it wisely. And when you have multiple speakers, that has to be divided up by everybody in a way that they feel they have their opportunity. And, you know, you want to give the temperature, not the weather report. The objective of the webinar is to inspire your audience to want to learn more. So if we go from that, let's take a little intermission on where we are between the acts. And what we covered today was the importance of setting the stage. This is just old-fashioned project management 101. Nothing can take the place of it. Getting the right audience, there's a lot of things from compelling invitation, getting the right list, executing the invitation strategy, and then it's being able to breathe life into your production. We're going to take and move into how we do table reads, how we get people to really breathe life. We do the dry runs, the sound checks, very important. We'll talk about the final checklist and going live and post-webinar follow-up that you need to use to start to convert. But what I'd like to do is to continue the conversation is to let you know that if you're interested, there is on LinkedIn a thought leadership group that we have on webinars and webcasts. Our website is chock full of best practice videos, case studies. We have a blog, ebooks. Also, as Joe said, I'm very excited about a series I'm going to be doing, a Lunch and Learn series at Content Marketing World, and it's going to be on how to develop a webinar series that works. Joe, I think this pretty much moves us into the Q&A. Go ahead and fire away.
Yeah, we have a number of questions in. If you would like to ask questions, please do. I can already tell you we're not going to get to all of them, but we're going to do the best that we can here and get through them. The one question I have here from Cassio, and we get this all the time, Mike, but Cassio is saying that struggles to get attendees through social networks, and most come from email. Can you talk about brands' experience success with that, or am I just relegated to that most of them are going to come from email?
We find probably 80%, 85% of our attendees and registrants come from email. We are currently working on using social media through LinkedIn, and we're seeing some interesting results. I would say that if you are in a LinkedIn group, that you are in a position to start a conversation, and once you get the conversation going and you get some feedback, by all means, add to the conversation that you're having a webinar on a certain topic and that you think people would be interested in. But to be specific to it, it's a numbers game. When I talk about 50,000 names or matched numbers, even though 99,250 are never going to come to my landing page, if I do it right, I'll get 250 of them. So I'm pretty aligned with using email marketing along with social media. Hopefully that answers it, Joe.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we've always had success with email. That's the best way to do it. But I like to look at, can you leverage your social media to get more email subscriptions and signups so that you can use that in your webinar promotion. So I like to think of it that way a little bit. What's the number one thing that you're seeing? There's a couple questions around this, Mike. What's the number one thing that you're seeing that is making a difference in webinars? Let's say maybe the one thing that they're forgetting to do, or the one big mistake, or the one big takeaway you want people to get from this.
If I had to summarize what that would be, it's to put yourself in the seat of a potential registrant or attendee. Is what you're promoting something that you would want to attend yourself? Is it going to stimulate your curiosity? Are you interested in it? What will you learn? How important is it? Does it feel like it's being presented in a professional, credible way? Or are you really being invited to a product demo that's going to be a sales pitch? And again, take the time to plan it, check for all the things we've gone over. I mean, you just have to work it and work it and work it. It's like a piece of clay. You mold it and polish it till it comes out the way you want it to be.
There's a couple questions here on charging for webinars. What's your take on that?
We have looked at paid webinars versus informational webinars, and it's a completely different animal. What I can tell you is we have had some clients that have used an informational webinar, such as what we're doing today, as a bridge to get people interested enough to pay for webinars. Go back to what you said, Joe. I think you said only 1% of the buying cycle is going to be addressed, or people are only in that 1% of the buying cycle. Most of the people are just gathering information. I think 70% of most B2B buyers prefer to do their research online before they want to talk to a live salesperson, meaning if you're going to charge for something, it better be good. It better have a lot of value. It better be to the point. So I would say that whatever it is you're going to charge for, make sure people are going to pay for it, because there's a world of difference between people who will pay for it and who will attend for free. That's my point.
Well, I think the other thing is, I mean, I grew up in the publishing industry, so we were magazine brands that were doing, we have very high credibility, and we tried to do paid ones, and they never worked. So there's, I mean, and not to say that it can't work, but it's very, very tough when there's so much free information out there to compete. You've got to have something amazingly valuable to really make that thing work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
What's too much to ask on a webinar invite? I mean, some of them I see they're asking for 75 questions. Some of them are 5 questions. I mean, what would you recommend as the base?
Just enough information to get a conversation started and to get an idea of who that individual is. And that, your name, the industry you're affiliated with, your organization, your job title. How did you hear about this webinar? That's always an interesting question. Excuse me, what would you like to learn? Those are the basics that we like to ask. Now, in some cases, the sponsor will want to know a couple other things. And if it's not invasive or salesy, we'll ask it. Less is better, Joe. Less is better. Let the people get on the landing page, register, get off.
But we've got a number of questions around archive webinars and webcasts. Can you go into a little bit of detail about the amount of people that watch the live event versus the archived event, and are archived-only events worth doing?
Yes. In fact, a client gave us a great tagline. They said that webinars are the content marketing gift that keeps giving. And what he meant by that is that So if you look at today's webinar, okay, and you look at the stats I gave, 40% of the people that registered are online. Now, they may want to go back and review the webinar, which is great. Certainly the people that didn't attend, we want them to view it. But we have some clients, and probably one of my favorite cases is we had a client, we did a timely webinar. We had 663 people register, 357 people attended. Would you like to know how many on-demand viewings we had, Joe?
I want to know. Tell me.
774. And 85% of those 774 were fresh new sales leads. They had not registered or attended. Why? Because the client promoted it in blogs, on their website, and through social media. Think about that. That didn't cost them anything extra. They already did the webinar. They leveraged that asset, and it became a great example of content marketing.
No,
so
I love that.
Yes.
Love that example, and I think it's important for everyone to remember that usually in general, of the, let's say 100% of the people that actually registered for the webinar, and 40%, as you said, Mike, generally show up, another 40%, so the whatever's left, you're going to get a total of 80% of those registered to view it at some portion, and that doesn't even count the additional registrations that you just said you can pick up.
Yeah, and one other thing to keep in mind is that some of the webinars we do have a true global reach. We'll get 60 countries to register for a webinar. Now, we know those countries that are outside of the North America time zone aren't going to attend, but it's a perfect opportunity where they opted in, hey, I'm interested in the topic. They can go view it 24/7 at their own convenience.
Dee's asking about webinar series, Mike. What do you feel versus a one-off webinar versus webinar series? How often is there an optimum amount to offering webinars?
I think the thing that you need to look at is how much value do you have? If you really have value and you have an audience, there's never too much you can give them. But as a matter of practicality, if you were to do a series on a quarterly basis, then I would say that would be an ideal amount. And I love series, and I think series are great. The one we're doing here with Bosch is a thought leadership series. We're doing one with a very interesting company called Rainmaker. We're doing a series of 4. It gives you an opportunity to build your brand, your equity, and your value, and it takes more thought. Doing one-offs are fine, but often doing the series is where the sustainable results come from. So absolutely do a series if you can. And that's actually what I'm going to be talking about at Content Marketing World.
Well, I think that you're right. There's so much opportunity with a webinar series, and to kind of move from that into informational versus sales webinars. How much can you sell during webinars? How much is too much? Should you keep it all in informational? Angela really wants to know that question.
Well, I'm going to give an example in June on exactly how that can be done. And the way I look at it is, if you're going to give information, then it's okay to get something in return, rather than asking for something before you give it. And so a way that we often do this, and I'll show this as an example, is at the end of the webinar, we can ask the audience, how do they rank now their need to whatever it is? And they'll rank it. And some of them will say, yes, have a sales consultant call me. Yes, I'd like to speak with you. It's perfectly appropriate at the end, but first you have to give value, then you can ask for something in return, and people are usually more than willing. If they're interested, they're going to tell you.
I think one more thing, we're getting a number of questions, Mike, just around how many email invitations and how many webinars and things like that. And I think the one thing to remember, if you're looking at a series, again, kind of back to that, is you're going to send out a lot of emails, and that's maybe the issue more than anything else. Is you could do a lot of webinars, but you also have maybe 3 to 5 accompanying direct emails associated with that. Is that the bigger concern there, the amount of email traffic that's going to them?
Yes, there's a balance between potentially fatiguing your audience. And I think fatiguing your audience is one of the reasons you tend to see a lot of unsubscribes. There are some industries that are more receptive and open to webinar invitations. There are others, like you and I talk about. We get 5 or 6 or 10 invitations a day. You really have to know your market and your industry. But if you are giving value, it's not an issue. it's not an issue. But that's certainly something that has to be factored in there, is how many times you're going to go after your audience. If it's value, go for it.
Mike, we have a lot more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I know those of you that we didn't get to your questions, Mike will take a look at those. We'll try to get back to those. Really appreciate everyone's time. Mike, thank you for the time. And I know this is just kind of the start of the series, and we've got another series ahead. What's the date on that? I believe the 26th next month.
June 26th. Yeah,
June
Joe.
26th.
Let me thank you, thank your team, Peter Leubel and Angela Vanucci for incredible help, and of course Caroline Billers from Citrix for pulling this all together. It's been a ball, and I can't wait for next month. And thank you for being such a great moderator.
No, thanks, Mike. You make it easy. Thanks to the folks at GoToWebinar for making this possible. We don't do enough webinars. We do a lot of webinars, but don't do enough webinars about webinars. And I think it's an art form, and you can learn a lot from, obviously, Mike. And we've got a lot more to talk about. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Have a great day.